The Unknown Soldier of World War I. World War I brought terror that went beyond the battles, a horror that seeped into the trenches, almost like an invisible yet palpable presence. In 1917, near the front lines in Verdun, something even stranger and more unsettling began to haunt our days, or rather, our nights. I was among the French soldiers who began to notice the presence of a peculiar soldier during night patrols. A man no one knew whose origin was shrouded in shadows. Night patrols were like Russian roulette with death. In small groups, we ventured out to monitor enemy movement, always alert to any sign of danger. Darkness was both our ally and our enemy. Any sound could attract gunfire, ambushes, or something worse. And it was in this darkness that he appeared for the first time. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, exhausted from the war and the constant terror. But no, I was lucid. And there he was. The first time I saw him, he seemed to emerge from nowhere. We were advancing through a field filled with craters, thick fog surrounded us like a wall. And then he was there, marching silently beside us. His steps were precise, emotionless. I glanced at him, and a coldness took over me. His face was partially hidden under the shadow of a helmet, but it was his uniform that made no sense. He wore attire that seemed from another time, something I could barely identify. He marched as if he had always been there, and he did not utter a single word. At first, I thought he was just a soldier from another unit lost in the confusion of the battlefield. But with each mission, the same man reappeared, always in the same way. And the scariest part? When we finally returned to the trench, he was never with us. He would vanish into the mist without a sound. I even tried to speak to him once, to confirm he was real. As I approached, he turned his face, and for a moment he looked directly into my eyes. I felt an indescribable chill, as if I was facing something that did not belong to our world. Without a word, he walked away, swallowed by the shadows. Among the men, stories and theories began to circulate. Some believed he was a deserter from a previous war, perhaps the Franco-Prussian War. Others whispered that he was an omen, a dark warning, that something terrible was about to happen. Strangely, every time he appeared during a mission, something bad would occur. Landmine explosions, ambushes, surprise artillery attacks. All seemed to happen when he was present. I was not the only one who feared his appearances. Even the air around him seemed denser, as if death had taken shape and infiltrated among us. A few days after the first appearance, I was assigned to another night patrol. As we left the trench, there he was marching ahead in silence. We tried to focus on the mission, but the weight of his presence broke my concentration. That night, an ambush awaited us. I remember the gunfire that erupted out of nowhere, the cries of pain, and the sheer panic. Of the 10 men who went out with me, only 3 returned alive. One of the survivors, covered in mud and with wide, fearful eyes, told me that the soldier vanished moments before the ambush, as if he knew what was coming. As days went by, the soldier came to be known as Le Fantôme de Verdun. No one attempted to speak to him anymore, and the men avoided him at all costs. Sometimes, someone refused to go out on patrol if he was present, fearing it would be a death sentence. I did not blame them. His presence seemed to consume the little hope we had left. The trench, already a dark place, became even more oppressive when we knew he could appear at any moment. One particularly cold night in October, another patrol returned completely shaken. One of the soldiers, covered in mud and blood, was unrecognizable. He said he saw the soldier entering one of the bomb craters. Driven by morbid curiosity, he decided to follow. But when he got there, he found only an old bayonet lodged in the ground, a weapon model that hadn't been seen since the Franco-Prussian War. How could it be there? It was as if that soldier were a living relic, a reminder of a forgotten war, forever trapped on that battlefield. Over time, the appearances dwindled. The officers tried to convince us it was all a product of fatigue and stress, that we were seeing things where there was nothing. But none of us believed that. Verdun held secrets, and he was the greatest of them all. To me, the face of that soldier, or what I could see of it, is etched in my memory. A reminder that some souls find no peace, forever bound to the horrors they endured. Years later, when the war finally ended, I returned to Verdun to honor fallen comrades. As I walked through the ruins and the old trenches, I felt something beside me. It was as if someone was there marching silently with me. I didn't have the courage to look, but I knew it was him, the unknown soldier forever bound to that land.
The invisible curse of the desert. The Gulf War was supposed to be a quick mission, straightforward. They told us it would be easy, a simple operation to secure a strategic base. But the moment we set foot in that desert, we knew we were wrong. The place was stifling. The sun scorched us mercilessly. The dry air sucked the breath from our lungs. And the silence, it was heavy, almost as if it were watching us. Something didn't want us there. At first it was just a feeling of vague unease. Walker, the youngest in our group, was the first to sense it. He muttered to himself, swearing there was something hiding in the dunes, a presence just outside our line of sight. We laughed, thinking it was just the heat getting to him, but Walker insisted he wasn't crazy. He claimed there were eyes on us. Every time he looked toward the horizon, it seemed like something was slipping away just before he could focus on it. Then one night, the whispers began. We were all silent, trying to survive the heat of the night, when we heard voices. They seemed to come from beneath the sand, as if something was trapped, struggling to break free. It was muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Ramirez, the veteran among us, went pale. He said he was hearing voices in Japanese. It seemed impossible, yet the terror on his face was real. He murmured that there might be something buried out here, something that should never be disturbed. Shortly after, we heard chains, metallic and dragging, as if someone were pulling something heavy across the sand. We looked around, but all we saw was sand. The sound seemed to come from all directions, and nowhere at the same time. Fear crept through our group. We didn't know what was happening, but we all felt it, something invisible surrounding us, something that did not want us here. Harris, the quietest of us all, decided to investigate. He didn't say much, but that night, he seemed determined to find the source of the sounds. He left the camp, and after a while, he returned with his face pale, eyes wide. He said nothing, just looked at us in silence. His expression alone was enough to tell us he had seen something, something he couldn't explain. When I asked what happened, he just shook his head, refusing to speak. In the early hours, we heard gunfire echoing through the desert. We all woke up startled, but all around us was only emptiness. It was as if the sounds were from another time, like echoes of a war that wasn't ours. Each night, the sounds grew louder, the whispers clearer, as if something was trying to communicate. The next morning, Harris was gone. I asked if anyone had seen him leave, but no one knew. He simply vanished. We searched for footprints, but they disappeared in the sand, as if he had been swallowed up by the desert. No trace, no sound. Harris was gone, and the men began whispering that the desert had claimed him as a sacrifice. Then we found a helmet partially buried in the sand, rusted and worn by time. Walker, pale as ever, picked up the helmet and said he could hear something inside it, a faint whisper, a voice barely there, in a language none of us recognized. When he set the helmet down, the sound stopped. We exchanged glances, but said nothing. We all knew something was there, something alive, in a way we couldn't understand. We tried to move on, to leave that place behind, but with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. At night, the desert seemed to pulse with life. Beneath my feet, I felt as though I was walking on bodies trying to rise. Finally, we decided to leave, and as I glanced back one last time, I saw a ghostly figure on the edge of the horizon, standing still, watching us. It was like a shadow hovering in the heat, a blur of sand that vanished into thin air as if it had never been there. Years later, I still hear those sounds. In my dreams, the chains rattle, and the whispers surround me again. Harris was never found. The desert took him, leaving him behind as an offering to an ancient, invisible secret that lies hidden in the endless sand.
The Supernatural Battle of Mons. In August 1914, I faced, for the first time, the terror and chaos of modern warfare. It was the beginning of what would become World War I, and we were sent to Mons in southern Belgium with a seemingly simple mission: to halt the advance of German troops. With each step on the battlefield, the tension and horror intensified. The sky darkened with smoke from explosions, and the ground trembled under the weight of soldiers who, deep down, knew they might never return. The numerical superiority of the Germans was overwhelming, and defeat seemed only a matter of time. On that humid, hot day, we were exhausted and cornered, fighting for our lives. It was then that something absolutely unexpected happened. Amid the fog and smoke of the explosions, an unusual vision began to form. At first, it was just a whisper among the ranks, the shadow or a strange movement at the edge of our sight. But, as the minutes passed, what initially seemed like a trick of the mind transformed into something undeniably real. Figures began to appear on the battlefield, hovering among us, confused and yet calm. The first soldiers to notice hesitated to report what they saw, fearing ridicule or accusations of cowardice. But, gradually, the murmurs gained momentum. I saw men pointing to shadowy figures wrapped in light, spectral soldiers dressed in medieval armor. The strangest part? These figures didn't seem affected by the sound of explosions, nor by the suffocating smoke. They were there marching among us, so serenely that it was almost as if time had paused just for them. As the minutes dragged on, the reports intensified. Some soldiers swore they saw ghostly archers, medieval figures with bows and arrows, as if they had emerged directly from the Battle of Agincourt far before our time. These invisible archers aimed their arrows at the Germans, and what we saw next was even more unsettling. The enemy retreated as if struck by an invisible force. It was as if these spectral warriors had come to protect us, bringing relief and a renewed sense of hope. At that moment, the word angels began to spread among the troops. Some said they were figures with wings, while others claimed to see only shadows cloaked in a glow, as if they were ethereal guardians. Whatever they were, those soldiers or angels gave us something we thought we had lost: the chance to survive. After the battle, rumors of the Angels of Mons spread rapidly. The troops were convinced that this had been a divine intervention, and many of us believed it. After all, how else could one explain the appearance of ghostly warriors with bows and arrows from another era, protecting us with a calmness that seemed to mock the very horror of war? Even the most skeptical among us found it hard to ignore what we had witnessed. Back in the trenches, among the survivors, we began to hear accounts from the captured German soldiers. Some of these prisoners spoke of an inexplicable feeling of fear and confusion, something that made them hesitate to advance. Others reported seeing hazy figures, shapes crossing the battlefield with a purpose, an invisible force they couldn't comprehend. All the accounts shared one common trait: a deep and inexplicable fear. After Mons, Many of us veterans of that battle bore the weight of that experience. The stories of angels and archers became living legends, filling the pages of newspapers and the public's imagination. People said that God or supernatural forces had granted us a second chance. Some even believed that the spirits of ancient warriors had returned to protect us, the souls of fallen soldiers from distant times, on one last mission of protection. Skeptics argued that it was all nothing more than hallucinations brought on by stress and exhaustion, a reaction of the human mind in a time of extreme need. However, for those of us who were there, who heard the invisible arrows and saw the hazy figures, the experience transcended any logical explanation. To this day, when I remember those days in Mons, I feel the same reverence mixed with fear. Gettysburg, Verdun, Mons battlefields where human suffering seems to transcend the physical realm. For many, what happened in Mons remains inexplicable. I myself carry these memories like a dark amulet, a reminder that, on that day, in the midst of horror, invisible forces marched beside us, becoming an inseparable part of the legend of war. Capturing the island of Peleliu. Capturing Peleliu Island. It seemed like a straightforward mission, a quick, brutal offensive to secure a strategic airbase. That's what we were told. But upon arrival, I realized nothing here would be simple. Peleliu was a slice of hell in the middle of the Pacific. The heat was suffocating, the ground mountainous and treacherous, and the jungle was so dense it felt as if it was closing in around us. Before long, the battle turned into one of the cruelest I've ever seen. With every step, we lost men. Each yard gained seemed to cost blood and sanity. The Japanese forces had transformed the island into a fortress of tunnels and caves, as if they had merged with the very land. Days of endless combat passed, and even after we had captured Peleliu, it didn't feel like we had won. Thousands of bodies, from both sides, were left behind, trapped in trenches and tunnels. The surviving Americans returned home with scars that went beyond flesh. But for me, and a few others who stayed behind to patrol and secure the territory, the true nightmare was yet to come. Soon after the official end of combat, the whispers began. Soldiers spoke of strange sounds, of visions no one could explain. I, Sergeant Henry Foster, was one of the first to experience something that defied all logic. During a night patrol, I was assigned with James, a fellow soldier, to monitor an abandoned cave, one of the strongholds used by the Japanese. We knew the cave entrance had been blocked by bombings, but as we approached that night, we heard something coming from inside. Muffled voices in Japanese. I stopped immediately, and the voices continued, a disjointed murmur echoing among the rocks. A part of me wanted to believe they were trapped survivors, but at the same time it seemed unlikely. We returned with reinforcements and a team of engineers to open the blocked entrance. When we finally managed to enter, the heavy air enveloped us. On the ground, we found only bones and scraps of uniforms. But the voices were still there, whispering in the shadows. I left that cave more disturbed than I had ever been in combat. There was no one alive there, yet somehow, the feeling that we were being watched was tangible. In the following weeks, the reports increased. Many of us, while patrolling the jungle, heard the sounds of boots marching, bayonets dragging, as if a battle was still underway. But upon investigating, we always found only silence and trees. One night, my lieutenant, Mark Thompson, a skeptic who mocked our stories, experienced something that changed his convictions. He recounted that while walking near an abandoned Japanese facility, he heard the sound of metal scraping on the ground. When he turned, he saw a bayonet, rusty and covered in moss, being dragged by an invisible hand. When Thompson picked it up, the sound ceased, and the object appeared lifeless, abandoned long ago. After that night, the lieutenant was never the same. He avoided talking about what he saw, and something in his eyes had changed, as if the island had devoured his disbelief. The apparitions continued. Soldiers reported shadowy figures. Japanese soldiers walking through the jungle, almost like silent patrols. They never interacted with us. They just marched, disappearing when we tried to approach. I recall one specific occasion. A patrol group, and I saw a solitary figure, a Japanese man in full uniform, walking along a trail. We shouted for him to surrender, but when he turned, his face seemed to melt into the mist, evaporating before our eyes. The natives of Polilliu, who had survived the war's devastation, had their own stories. One day, while on guard duty, an elder told me that Polilliu was a sacred place, a land where the dead warriors roamed without rest. The battle, he explained, had reawakened an ancient curse. To him, the souls of the fallen soldiers, Japanese and American, were trapped there, eternally reenacting their final moments. We listened to these stories with a mixture of respect and fear. Many of us began refusing to go on night patrols. Private Smith, stationed near a cave, swore he heard faint knocking as if someone was trying to get out. One night, he told me he saw a skeletal hand trying to crawl through a crack in the rock. I looked into his eyes, and the intensity of his terror was so genuine. I preferred not to question it. The higher-ups tried to maintain order, threatening punishment for anyone who failed to carry out their duty. But it was hard to keep discipline on an island where the jungle felt alive with the memories of the dead. When I returned home, years later, Polilliu was left behind, but it never completely left me. Sometimes, in dreams, I hear the sound of boots marching and voices murmuring in Japanese. And whenever I think of going back, I feel as if something is waiting, as if the island doesn't want to let me go. Today, Polilliu is almost forgotten by the world. But I know that if someone enters those caves, they may still hear the whispers of the soldiers who never left the battlefield.
If you love mysteries and the supernatural, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Leave a like to support the work and share with friends who are into the supernatural. Your engagement keeps these secrets alive.